Someone disrespected you. Not violently, not loudly. Subtly, the way a blade enters between the ribs rather than through them. A dismissive tone in a meeting, a boundary crossed and then laughed off. A silence where acknowledgment should have been, and you said nothing. You smiled or you deflected, or you told yourself it was not worth the conflict. Then you drove home and replayed it 17 times. That is not patience. That is not maturity. That is the architecture of a man who has not yet decided what he is made of. The modern world has sold you a story about the high road. It has dressed passivity in the language of wisdom. It has told you that to absorb disrespect quietly is a form of strength. It is not. It is a fracture in the marble, small, invisible from a distance, but widening under every new weight placed upon it. The Stoics were not gentle philosophers sitting in warm libraries. Marcus Aurelius commanded legions. Epictetus was a slave who forged an iron mind under conditions that would shatter most men alive today. Seneca moved through a court of vipers, navigating power and poison with the same calm hand. These were not men who absorbed disrespect because they lacked the fire to respond. They were men who had mastered the calculus of when fire serves and when it destroys. The distinction is everything. The weak man reacts because he cannot contain what he feels. The disciplined man responds because he has decided what the moment requires. One is driven by the fracture. The other operates from the core, that silent, gold-filled center that no external slight can reach without permission. In ancient Rome, a sovereign did not answer every insult with a sword. He noted it. He filed it in the cold architecture of his mind. He understood that the man who forces you to react has, in that moment, taken command of you. Your reaction becomes his instrument. Your anger becomes his leverage. And you, the one who believed you were defending your dignity, have handed it over completely. This is the paradox that has survived every empire's collapse. The man who appears to absorb the blow often holds the most power in the room. Not because he is weak, because he is calculating. Because his silence is not surrender, it is the shadow before the blade moves. You have been taught to perform your responses, to show, immediately and visibly, that you will not be treated a certain way. This is not protocol, this is theater, and theater is for audiences, not for sovereigns. The Stoic does not perform his strength, he deposits it. Every slight that passes through him without breaking him becomes iron added to the forge. Every moment of controlled silence becomes a layer of marble around a mind that no dismissal. No provocation, no casual cruelty can reach without consequence. But here is where the architecture becomes precise. There must be consequence. The warrior who absorbs without ever responding does not become stone. He becomes a mirror that the world learns it can spit on freely. Silence without eventual, deliberate, cold response is not discipline. It is surrender wearing a philosophical mask. The disrespect protocol is not about revenge. It is not about ego. It is about the cold, clear signal that you send to the world about what you are made of, not in the heat of the moment, but at a time and in a manner entirely of your own design. What you carry forward from this moment is not a technique. It is a shift in how you read the room, how you file what happens to you, and how you decide, with the stillness of marble and the patience of a man who knows exactly where the fracture lines run, when and how the response comes. The paradox that makes what follows necessary is this. The most powerful response to disrespect is often invisible to the person who delivered it, until it is far too late for them to prepare. The most powerful response to disrespect is often invisible to the person who delivered it, until it is far too late for them to prepare. This is not metaphor. This is the operating principle of every sovereign who has ever held ground in a world designed to erode it. And it rests on two pillars, not rules, not techniques, but structural truths that, once understood, reorder how you move through every room you enter. The first pillar is this: you do not own your reaction, you own your response. These are not the same thing. A reaction is what happens when the fracture is struck and the marble splits along its weakest line. It is involuntary, it is loud, it announces the exact location of every crack you have failed to fill. The man who raises his voice in a meeting the moment he is dismissed has just handed the room a map of his interior, every unhealed wound marked in red, every insecurity flagged and visible. The disciplined man feels the same fire. Do not mistake his stillness for the absence of heat. The forge is burning. But he has learned something the weak man has not. Fire directed outward in the wrong moment destroys the one who wields it as readily as the one it touches. So he contains it. He channels it downward into the iron of his resolve, and he waits. Waiting is not passivity. It is the most aggressive act available to a man who understands time as a weapon. Epictetus, who owned nothing, not his body, not his freedom, not his name, understood this with a clarity that comfort never produces. He could not control what was done to him. He could not control the contempt of those who believed his chains defined him. What he controlled was the architecture of his interior, the stone walls that no external force could breach without his permission. That interior sovereignty made him, in every room he entered, the most powerful man present. Not because of what he said, because of what he refused to let reach him. Consider this. A sovereign walks into a room where a decision has been made without him. A decision that affects his domain directly. The man who made it, call him the weak. Though he would not recognize himself in that mirror, delivers the news casually, almost as an afterthought. The tone says, your input was not required. The subtext says, you are not the kind of man whose absence is noticed. The sovereign says nothing in that moment. He does not correct the tone. He does not demand acknowledgment. He nods once, with the kind of stillness that unsettles people who expected either submission or explosion. He files it not in anger, but in the cold architecture of his memory, where it joins every other piece of information he has gathered about this man's character. 3 weeks later, when the project built on that decision begins to fracture, because decisions made without the right voices always fracture, the sovereign is not there to rescue it. He is not unavailable out of spite. He is unavailable because he has already redirected his attention, his resources, and his presence towards something that will outlast the wreckage. The weak man will not understand what happened. He will not see the response. He will only feel its shape, the absence of a hand that was never offered. The silence of a man who decided, quietly and without announcement, that some rooms are not worth entering twice. That is the first pillar in motion. The second pillar is harder. Most men never reach it. It is this: the response must be proportional to the pattern, not the moment. This is where the warrior separates from the philosopher. The warrior understands force. He knows how to respond to a direct attack. But the philosopher understands something the warrior often does not, that a single moment of disrespect is data, not verdict. One dismissal does not define a man's character, it reveals a possibility. What follows reveals the pattern. The Stoic watches the pattern. He does not react to the first stone thrown, he notes it. He watches where the next one lands. He builds in the silence of his observation. A complete picture of what he is dealing with, not with the hot urgency of someone who needs to be right, but with the cold patience of a man who is assembling a case. He intends to win without ever raising his voice. Seneca understood this. He spent years in a court where the wrong response to the wrong slight meant exile or death. He did not survive by being louder than the danger. He survived by being more patient than it. By understanding that the man who needs to respond immediately is the man who has already lost the frame. The frame belongs to whoever holds it longest with the least visible effort. In the modern architecture of offices, relationships, and social hierarchies, this translates with precise accuracy. The colleague who undermines you once may be having a bad quarter. The colleague who does it 3 times has shown you his character. The response you build for a pattern is not the same as the response you build for a moment. One requires adjustment. The other requires consequence, cold, deliberate, and delivered at a time when the recipient has already forgotten the original offense. That forgetting is important. It means the response lands not as retaliation, which can be defended against, but as consequence, which cannot. And here is what happens to the man who does not learn these 2 pillars. He reacts too early and reveals his fractures. The room learns where to press. Every future interaction becomes a negotiation in which he is already at a disadvantage. Because the architecture of his interior has been mapped by people who will use that map without hesitation. Or he absorbs without ever responding. He becomes the mirror that the world learns it can spit on freely. His silence, which he has dressed in the language of patience and philosophy, is not iron. It is the slow collapse of a structure that was never reinforced. And one day, not dramatically, not with a single visible event, he finds that he has been removed from rooms he never noticed he was being excluded from. Decisions made without him, respect withheld so long it calcified into assumption. Neither of these is a warning, they are facts. They are the documented outcomes of men who did not build the architecture while the marble was still workable. The cracks do not announce themselves. They simply widen silently, invisibly, until the weight of the next slight finds them. And the structure that took years to build comes down in a moment that everyone around you saw coming long before you did. The structure that took years to build comes down in a moment that everyone around you saw coming long before you did. So you will not let that moment come. What follows is not a list of tactics. It is not a script for confrontation. It is a protocol, 3 commands, forged from the same iron that Epictetus shaped in chains, that Marcus refined under the weight of empire, that Seneca carried through a court that wanted him dead. These commands do not require volume, they do not require witnesses. They require only the cold, architectural precision of a man who has decided, once and without revision, what he is made of. You are not here to perform, you are here to build. First, file never flinch. When disrespect arrives, your only visible response is stillness. Not the stillness of a man who did not feel it. The stillness of a man who felt it completely and chose, in that fraction of a second, to deposit it rather than discharge it. You file the moment, the tone, the context. The pattern, it either begins or continues, into the cold architecture of your memory. You do not reference it aloud, you do not signal that it landed. The weak man needs the room to know he was struck. The sovereign needs only himself to know. That asymmetry is your first advantage. The person who disrespected you believes the ledger is clean, while you are already building the case. The man who thinks he got away with something is the most exposed man in any room. Second, audit the pattern, not the moment. A single stone does not build a wall, and a single slight does not define a character. After the first incident, you observe. After the second, you begin to understand. After the third, you know. The Stoic does not respond to moments. He responds to verdicts, and verdicts require evidence gathered in silence. In the modern architecture of offices and relationships, this means you do not adjust your behavior after one dismissal. You watch. You note whether the tone repeats, whether the boundary is tested again, whether the pattern reveals a man who is careless or a man who is deliberate. The distinction matters because the response to carelessness is correction, and the response to deliberate disrespect is consequence, and these are not the same instrument. The man who mistakes one for the other wastes his iron on the wrong forge. Third, withdraw the architecture. When the pattern is confirmed, you do not confront. You restructure. You quietly, methodically, and without announcement, begin to remove the access that person has to your time, your energy, your presence, and your investment. Not in anger, not as punishment, as the cold, logical conclusion of an audit that has reached its finding. The sovereign does not burn bridges. He simply stops maintaining them. And in a world where most men are sustained by the invisible labor of those they have underestimated, that withdrawal is the most devastating response available. They will not see it coming because they never saw you clearly to begin with. The blade that moves in silence lands before the target has shifted. You are not a finished structure. You are unfinished marble, and that is not a weakness. It is the condition of every man who has not yet surrendered to the comfortable lie that he is already complete. The cracks you carry are not evidence of failure. They are the exact locations where the gold goes. Kintsugi is not the art of hiding fractures. It is the art of making them the most valuable part of the surface, filling every break with something harder and more luminous than what was there before. Every disrespect you have absorbed without breaking. Every silence you have held when fire wanted to speak. Every moment you chose the cold architecture over the visible reaction. That is gold being poured into the fault lines of a mind that is becoming. Slowly and without ceremony, something that cannot be broken by the same force twice. The world will continue to test the structure. That is not a threat. It is the function of the world to press against every surface until it finds the fracture, and then to press harder. The sovereign does not resent this. He uses it. Every test that does not break him is a calibration. Every disrespect that passes through the protocol and becomes consequence rather than reaction is another layer of iron around a mind that was already becoming impenetrable. This is not a destination. There is no moment where the work is finished and the marble is sealed and nothing can reach you. The forge is always burning. The protocol is always active. The audit is always running. What changes is not the presence of pressure, it is your relationship to it. The disciplined man does not hope for fewer stones thrown. He builds walls that make the throwing irrelevant. You came here because something was done to you that you did not know how to answer. You leave here with the architecture of an answer that requires no words, no witnesses, and no permission from the person who delivered the original slight. You leave with the cold, gold-filled understanding that the most powerful response in any room is the one that arrives long after the room has forgotten there was ever a question. File it, audit it, withdraw the architecture. The marble remembers everything. The sovereign acts when he chooses. Only those who refuse comfort will understand what comes next. Subscribe to Marble and Mind.